Hey everybody, this is Perch, and I'm very excited to bring you a sales analysis for one of the events that really captured the imagination, the interest, and yes, the hatred of comic fans around the world. This is, of course, Heroes in Crisis sales analysis. Heroes in Crisis was certainly a controversial event brought to us by Tom King, who was enjoying at the time, pretty spectacular run in comics. He'd created The Vision, which was a dark, introspective look at the famous Avenger. He was hired on to an exclusive contract with DC and immediately took the reins of Batman, which was hailed as a pretty massive move at the time. Scott Snyder had been doing a good job with the title. People loved that run with Greg Capullo, but Tom King was promising some new elements to the book, and a decent amount of people were ready for a breath of fresh air with the title. Coming off of Rebirth, DC seemed to have a lot going for it, and Tom King was announced shortly thereafter of writing Heroes in Crisis. The word crisis in events always means quite a big deal in DC as a major transformational event, and what we got was certainly sparked a lot of conversation. The event ultimately took us through the kind of psychological impact of trauma of Wally West, who in a brief instant of weakness snapped and murdered everyone in a facility designed to care for heroes who were having trouble coping with everything that they were taking on. The series primarily starred Booster Gold and Harley Quinn as the main antagonists, but Wally West came into the picture, as well as appearances by most of the rest of the DC universe. The title was really kind of captured by a number of confessional-style comments that at times irritated long-term fans, like where Hal Jordan said, "I don't even know what willpower is," or other comments that seemed really at odds with the character. Ultimately, critics decided that the book seemed to break several people inside the DC universe and do more damage than good, but let's see how well it sold. The title had 9 issues. It ran from September 2018 to May 2019. It had variant covers throughout, which certainly spiked some of the sales, and we're going to take you through what it looked like. This was the follow-up event series after Metal and Doomsday Clock. Now, Doomsday Clock ran all the way through this due to series delays, but this is a time period, as we'll see later, where DC basically ran 3 fairly major events within the course of about a year and a half. So, critical reception of this book, as I mentioned, some sites really liked it. Comic Book Bin, Multiversity, IGN rated it fairly highly. Newsarama rated it terribly. And comicbook.com, Paboom, others. Ultimately, this series nets out slightly higher than average. So I think the Metacritic score that I've seen sits somewhere, if you really assess everything properly, at around 6. Around 5.5 to 6 is where it's at. Interestingly enough, Bounding Into Comics rated it I believe a 7. So they rated it pretty highly compared to other things. Just for saying. So how did the series do? Well, let's take a look. So issue 1 struck off really large at 153,000 copies sold, and it was a big event. The series, which featured almost the entire DC universe sitting, looking somewhat somber, as though somebody was dead. And certainly people had died. It gathered a lot of interest, but like a lot of number 1 issues, immediately fell in issue 2, losing about a third of its audience for the second issue. And as the series went on, it continued to shed its readers until you get to about issue number 5. And at about issue number 5, it levels out. It finds its floor, and it stays almost remarkably consistent between issue 5 and issue 9. Now, this is a couple things are going on here. Keep in mind, comic shops are ordering ahead by about 3 months. So the number you're seeing between issue number 3 and issue number 5 is where it's finally calibrating at the comic shop of what they are going to sell. Do a quick look online, you're going to find that Heroes in Crisis number 1 can be picked up in mint condition for around $6 to $7, just a couple dollars above cover price. So it really indicates that there was a lot of over-ordering and plenty of stock that remains. Issues later in the series tend to have higher value because it found its floor and ultimately it found its audience. But if you look at issue 5 to issue 9, we're really talking about about 3,000 unit difference between those issues, and over 5 issues, that's very low. That's fairly abnormal. In fact, if you toss in issue number 4 as well, so 4 to 9, you're talking about 6 issues with less than 10,000 units sold of difference. That's very flat. So what it indicates is a lot of people came in from issue 1, they noped out pretty quickly, and it immediately tapered off. Or another way you could read this is comic shops ordered huge, realized this thing wasn't going to sell like the other events that were going on at the time, and quickly calibrated their orders. Overall, what this shows is in total, across the entire 9 issues, 832 units moved for the entire series. This was an average, if you take everything out, and definitely issue 1 heavily tilts the whole picture, 92,000 average units per title. So under the 100,000 kind of threshold, which a lot of event comics DC was doing at the time, certainly Doomsday Clock and Metal fell into this. 100,000 was, low for them by average of title, and they tended to sell above that range, and most events tended to sell above that range for DC. Remember, DC doesn't do nearly as many events, or didn't used to do nearly as many events as Marvel, so they still had a bit of a special feel to them. If we look at the trend line here, you'll see kind of everything I've been saying. So 48% drop from issue 1 to issue 9. That's a decent amount. It basically lost half of its audience. But the real story here is that the core Tom King audience came into effect around issue 4 to issue 5 and then just stayed with the series just very, very calmly. Now, these numbers, interestingly enough, fall slightly lower than what Tom King was bringing in on Batman, which indicates that even for an event, well, I mean, you can look at it two ways. Batman is a very strong seller, so is outselling an event. Or you could look at it and say that Tom King had more interest going in Batman than this series, maybe as a result of people realizing it was a Booster Gold Harley Quinn book as opposed to more of the DC universe. So let me give you some context in all this. As I said, the drop from issue 1 to issue 2 is higher than most event series, certainly within DC, even with the variants and even with all the other tricks they're doing. The sharp drop off from 1 to 2, basically losing a third of its overall audience, is bigger than you'd expect. If you toss Marvel into the picture, it's even more significant. This is somewhat abnormal that drop was so significant, lost a third of its volume. The back half of the event, as I mentioned, was unusually stable. Typically what you see is a back half of the event tends to start to dip back up again. And the reason being is people come into these events, they get the first issue, they tend to taper off, and then they come back for the ending because that's generally where the big surprises and tee up for the next event or the new status quo happened. That did not occur here. The lowest selling issue in Heroes in Crisis was the last issue. It got no final bump at the end. And that's unusual for an event. Typically, you see that kind of effect happen. And so in short, this series quickly found its core audience and it just stayed there. Now let's put in some context to some other events. So we had Heroes in Crisis, we had Metal, we had Doomsday Clock, all of which kicked off pretty much within a year's time span. So Heroes in Crisis started in September for 9 issues. Metal was 6 issues in August of 2017, a year earlier, and Doomsday Clock November, a little less than a year earlier, with 12 issues. And as I said, it ran concurrently with Heroes in Crisis because of delays in shipping. So if we look at the highs and lows of each one of these, Heroes in Crisis really starts to come into picture. Metal and Doomsday Clock were much higher selling events. So Metal, even the lowest selling issue of Metal, sold more units and sold more copies than the highest selling issue of Heroes in Crisis. And Doomsday Clock had a much higher first issue, and its low was higher than all but the first issue of Heroes in Crisis. There was just more interest in both of those two events. Now, despite that, Doomsday Clock did have a higher drop-off at 59%, and which is really indicated by kind of the delays in the shipping of that series. Doomsday Clock suffered massively from delays, and you saw it in how the title was ultimately bought over time. It still didn't have that sharp drop-off from issue 1 to issue 2. The drop-off of that event happened over the course of the series. If we look at the average issues sold per series, as I mentioned, Heroes in Crisis, 92,507 average units per issue. Dark Knight's Metal, 176. So almost just under double per issue average to Heroes in Crisis. And Doomsday Clock, despite the delays, averaged out at 142,000 units per issue. That's pretty significant, and it gives you some context about how people saw these events. Now, the $1 million literally question is, how much money did Tom King make for DC? So let's take a look at that. Basically, this comic, if you look here at the blue bars, it shows what we're making per issue, $610,000 for the first, and then it settles down into about $325,000 to $314,000 for issues 5 through 9. All told, you sum it all up, full retail is $3,321,914. So if you're buying based off the cover price, this is what this series is bringing in, $3.3 million. Now, the interesting piece is, what is a comic store cut? Well, before we get to that, let me do a little bit of an explanation. So the margin that comic shops receive varies between 35% to 60%. Now, it's done by unit orders. There's a lot of things that factor in there. A general rule of thumb is to use 45% for the comic store take. That's what we're going to use here. The margin that goes to the publisher also has to be shared with the distributor, and that doesn't cover the cost to make the comic. What I'm going to show you here is the sum of the publisher and the distributor, not including the cost. So just keep in mind as you're seeing this number that Diamond needs to take their cut, and you certainly have to pay the cost of making the comic in order to kind of get the full numbers. Now, why don't I have exact figures there? Well, again, it varies. There's different deals that take place. I want to present accurate information as close as I can, or at least show you the math. So what we're doing is just showing a general take to the publisher distributor, and you can kind of work out for yourself what that must have cost. So the publisher estimate here is about $1.5 million, 1494, about $1.5 million is what this 9-issue series made. Now, for what it's worth, we're going to look at trade numbers in a minute, but these are for the floppies. So if you're thinking about DC take home, they have to share some of this with Diamond. They certainly have to pay for the comic itself. 9 issues, Heroes in Crisis, about $1.5 million they get to take. So what can we gain from this? Well, again, issues 1 through 4 had a significant $263,000 difference in revenue, meaning they spiked those numbers really high for the first issue, 610, but then they lost almost half of it by the time they got to issue number 4. Obviously, that's not what you want to see in a bet. Issues 5 through 9 had only an $11,000 difference in revenue from start to finish. $11,000 over the course of 5 issues. That's pretty remarkable. That's very little money. And keep in mind, this is full retail. We're not even talking about the cut. So that's an interesting number. Now, to give you some context, what did these series make against others? Heroes in Crisis was at $3.3 million compared to Metal. Now, keep in mind, Metal had 6 issues, not 9, so fewer comics, still made $4.6 million. Doomsday Clock with 12 made $8.6 million. And these are, again, just the floppies, but this is kind of how it compares in terms of events at DC and who brought in what. So the publisher estimate, as I mentioned before, about 1.5 for Heroes in Crisis, about 2.1 for Metal, and about 3.8 for Doomsday Clock. Granted, these are not apples to apples. Heroes in Crisis had 9 issues, Metal had 6, Doomsday Clock had 12, so a little bit of some different things going on here. Now, let's talk about trade sales real quick. So trade sales, the hardcover edition of Heroes in Crisis sold 4,944 copies through Diamond at a cost of $29.99. Now, there are certainly some additional copies that were sold through other channels, but this is the information we have. This is the bulk of it. This brought DC about $148,000 worth of revenue, or, again, taking their cut. Trades are different, about $66,000. Not a terrible amount for hardcover. I mean, this is kind of underperforming for a giant event that you're going to do a hardcover for. Now, numbers become much harder for softcover, in part because DC switched distributors, COVID, a number of different factors means it's hard to gather, but the softcover certainly sold far more than the hardcover. So again, rough estimate, if you're talking about maybe a 3X version, you're basically coming in at under $500,000 in total, even if you're being extremely generous for hardcover and softcover for this series. Is that success? Not terribly for an event. Now, if we're going to look at Amazon today, and Amazon numbers change by the hour, but today Heroes in Crisis is number 613 in literary graphic novels, and it's number 1,076 in DC Comics and graphic novels. This 613 number is almost irrelevant. There's a lot of graphic novels that don't show up in that category. So it's a little bit of a weird number. The right one is to go with the 1076. So of all the DC graphic novels sold on Amazon, Heroes in Crisis is sitting at 1076. And for fun, it's also sitting at 1079 in post-traumatic stress disorder books. So that's a fun fact there. So there you go. Let's wrap it all up. What have we learned here? Well, to summarize, Tom King as an event writer has a very loyal audience, but it's definitely smaller than the normal DC event audience. So, Tom King brings a certain group of fans who like his work and like what he does, and they stick with him. It's the numbers of fluctuation is extremely small. And this is why DC has Tom King on these limited series. That's where he can draw his loyal audience. He's not confusing things with the bigger event audience. And this is basically where, the sweet spot of where you have Tom King. It's why they have him doing what they're doing. Him as an event writer is probably not a good idea. He turns off people as much as he has his loyal audience that follows things. It's not a good financial decision, but he definitely has a role in the company where he can bring his loyal audience to a particular title and have some pretty reliable revenue there. Here's the the big reveal at the end, in this case that Wally West was a mass murderer, brought in no new readers. So there was no spike, no bump, no change. Despite this shocking change in status quo, for a major character, people have been begging to have returned to the DC universe via the New 52 where he didn't appear. Nobody came back to this series to see it, which is very, very interesting and probably the most damning thing about this entire summary. And then 3 big events over 2 years, it has diminishing returns. That's entirely clear in what you see here. And this is a lesson both publishers could definitely stand to learn. Also, hey, you know what? It's a bad idea to run an event that dramatically alters characters, in this case Wally West, and doesn't bring in that big revenue for the company or that big push at the end, particularly when those characters have a huge financial upside in their own titles. Right now, the Flash series starring Wally West, certainly underselling what Heroes in Crisis did. From what I gather, it's selling around 50 to 60,000, but it's close. And if you think about a monthly ongoing title, if you're able to bring in those numbers, that's more valuable to you than bringing in 70 to 80,000 readers and units sold on an event book. Just saying. So maybe big disastrous, let's ruin a status quo of a character, let's paint a person as a dark, evil murderer. Maybe that's taking money off the table rather than bringing it on. Just saying. Anyway, this is the analysis of Heroes in Crisis. Obviously, what you can read from this is that Tom King has value to a company. That's why DC continues to employ him, give him new work, have him do new series. He brings in audience that will make them cash. It's just maybe not as an event writer. So there you go. Questions, comments, other pieces from the analysis, let me know in the comments below. And most importantly, and as always, thanks for listening.